This movie was originally posted on September 1st, 2012. This was a Rewind United review, which of course doesn't fall into the Superhero Rewind category. These days we have both Superhero Rewind and the occasional Science Fiction Rewind, and if I ever review anything in this format that doesn't fall into that category, it probably will be called a Rewind United again, especially if I get a request with donation for a movie that isn't a superhero thing or a science fiction thing. Who Framed Roger Rabbit is one of my favorite movies of all time. I'm really excited to present this review again. I was always really proud of it. There is one mistake in particular that is really funny that I have left in because I'm not cutting anything out of these reviews that you might have heard me talk about in the past on the No Prize show. I'll leave that one to you to find on your own if you don't already know about it. But anyway, without further ado, here is Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and thanks as always, everybody, for listening.
Rewind United is an in-depth analysis of movies chosen by our viewers. If you haven't seen this movie, I strongly urge you to watch it before seeing this review. Trying to break down the sheer awesomeness that is Who Framed Roger Rabbit is like trying to explain why I love lemon meringue pie. I kind of just want to say, go consume it. Words can't describe. The thing speaks for itself. If you've seen it, you already know why it was so well received when it was released and why a lot of movie buffs and fans alike consider it one of the best movies of the 1980s. Unless you don't like cartoons. I suppose some people don't like cartoons, and other people don't like lemon meringue pie, and there'd be no point in my trying to explain the life-changing experiences I've had with both of those things to those people either. Though I imagine there may be even more people who would recognize Who Framed Roger Rabbit as a tour de force than even those who enjoy lemon meringue pie. But I digress. If I were to take a poll of people who love this movie and ask them why, I imagine a lot of them would tell me it's because it blends the animation with the live action so well. It wasn't the first thing to try it, of course. There's a scene in Mary Poppins that does the same thing, and surprisingly well for the time, but it was the first time we saw so much animation mixed with live action elements, and the first time they all cast shadows, felt like they had the same kind of weight and dimension as the human characters, interacted in complex ways with real objects, and even carried around a lot of physical props in their animated hands. Out of 1 hour and 43 minutes, at least 45 to 50 minutes of this are animated. And that's an absolute necessity in making something like this work. If we don't believe the humans and cartoons are really in the same room, we can't believe anything this universe is selling us. Stories are about characters. We want to care what a protagonist does, what happens to him, and what his story says about the world or people or society at large, or whatever the story happens to be about. But trying to make a movie like this has the added annoyance of having something to prove before it can ever start doing all of that. Not to mention the excruciating costs involved. You open a book, you start reading, there's your character. You're breaking status quo, and bam, you're in the story. You might have some extra work to do if your prose is about, say, a world where cartoons exist in the world along with humans, and there's a cartoon rabbit who's framed for murder, and a human private detective is trying to get to the bottom of it. There's some definite suspension of disbelief that story is going to have to work hard at to create for the reader, but at least it doesn't have to visually make all of that real. Who Framed Roger Rabbit has an inspired human story about a main character, Eddie Valiant, with real dimension, who I grow to care about, who has a character arc and a real opportunity for change, a gripping mystery to solve, high stakes involved in solving it, an internal and an external conflict that are tied at the hip, and a menacing antagonist who creates the conflict that propels Eddie's character arc. The story is there. But if that rabbit doesn't look like he's kissing that man, it doesn't just kill the jokes, it kills the entire story. Having said all that, if Bob Hoskins as Eddie Valiant still looked like he was really handcuffed to Roger Rabbit, like he was really holding him down in the dishwater, like he was really aiming a cartoon mallet when he's about to get chainsawed by Judge Doom, but there wasn't a compelling story behind all of that, if we didn't remember Eddie Valiant, Roger Rabbit, Jessica Rabbit, and Judge Doom a week later, we'd just say, well, that was impressive, and we'd move on. When I was working on my Terminator 2 review, I learned that The Abyss won an Oscar for Best Visual Effects, but who talks about that movie anymore? The liquid effect used for the T-1000 was created in The Abyss, but it's Terminator 2 people still talk about. Sure, that effect is all over Terminator 2, where it was just used in one scene in The Abyss, but still, why isn't that film held up as a crown jewel for creating that brilliant effect? Why does Terminator 2 get all the credit for it, even though the same visual effects team, under direction of James Cameron in both movies, came up with it? It's because how that effect is used in a memorable story sticks with people more than just seeing the effect itself. In Roger Rabbit, the story and the effects are working in tandem to immerse me in one of the most imaginative worlds I can recall seeing on screen. The film has three main goals in mind, and they all complement each other. It puts the story first, and that's why it works. In the DVD commentary, Bob Zemeckis talks about the painstaking work that went into giving Eddie Valiant a believable character motivation, and finally they settled on a Toon having killed his brother, which informs his entire character arc. Zemeckis understood that if he didn't put the storytelling first, everything else he wanted to do with this movie would fall flat. The second goal is to make the movie a love letter to the history of traditional animation. That goal greatly influences the story and is a lot of where its most clever ideas come from. Setting it in the late 40s and making it an alternate history where it's the same animation studios, but the cartoons are real beings who live in their own town and are treated by humans practically like second-class citizens, and creating a whole set of rules for how the Toons operate based on what was in the classic Warner, Disney, and Tex Avery cartoons. I think one of the biggest successes in the movie is how many licenses it managed to obtain for familiar cartoon characters, rather than having a world just populated by nothing but generic, made-up cartoons. It makes the alternate history a recognizable place because it's filled with characters we all recognize. And it reminds us just how many of our beloved cartoon characters came from that time period and continued to endure. It does what only the most successful of homages pull off. It becomes a major historical moment in the very genre it's a tribute to. This is the first and very possibly the last time we'll see Disney and Warner Brothers cartoons all inhabiting the same world, much less Daffy and Donald playing a piano duet together or Mickey and Bugs both falling at the same time. And these scenes aren't great just because Zemeckis managed to get Warner's to let him use their characters. It's a Disney film, and so those characters were already available. But they're also funny, memorable, and classic scenes, 100% true to those characters. Mickey is nothing but helpful to Eddie, telling him he probably shouldn't listen to Bugs, but Bugs Bunny likes to mess with people and hands him a spare tire instead of a parachute, following up with the only possible line, "Ain't I a stinker?" You've got people who love and understand these old cartoons, and it shows up over and over and over again in the work. Ending the movie with Porky Pig saying "That's all, folks," followed by Tinkerbell flicking her magic wand, is one of the classiest moves I've ever seen in a movie. It's also important that with all the licensed characters, that the new characters feel like they belong among them. Roger Rabbit doesn't feel like a Bugs Bunny clone, nor does he feel generic. He has his own trademark personality and quirks, and again, he works because these filmmakers have an uncanny understanding of the world of classic cartoons. The final goal is to do something that's never been done before on screen, and that's making us really believe these cartoons and humans are interacting in the same space the whole film. It worked because the first two things were there. There's a story to tell and a specific nostalgic feeling the movie wants to convey, and if the people making the movie believe they've got something truly special, they've got to make those innovations work to make it happen on screen. You can listen to the DVD commentary to learn exactly how they did a lot of those amazing effects, all the puppeteering that went into having these real props moving around to later have animated characters drawn in to look like they're manipulating those objects. Some of the most impressive are Roger breaking plates, the penguins in the club running around delivering drinks, and the high-speed car chase with Eddie and Roger riding in a cartoon car. But the man who should be given the most credit for really making all this work is Bob Hoskins, who has a natural ability to make us believe he's actually reacting to Roger's and the other Toon shenanigans. If Eddie Valiant was miscast, there'd be no movie, and he brings an incredible energy with his pantomime, and he and Roger have an unusual chemistry that sells everything else. Bob Hoskins plays a character who feels like he's lived in this world and experienced it. It's because of him we believe the Toons are real and that there can be any emotional weight to such an initially silly concept as humans and Toons living in the same world. The plot, rather than a straight loony cartoon itself, is a detective story about cartoons. It has a lot of very funny scenes, but the comedy is all part of propelling the story along. Like the action scenes in the best action movies, the jokes in Roger Rabbit serve the narrative, and everything that happens feels natural within the context of the universe. So we get great moments like after Benny gets his tires dipped and he can't drive anymore, and we get to see a car driving another car. In what other movie can you naturally contrive a way to get a car driving another car? What really grounds the movie is that there's an established set of rules about the Toons, so we know what they can and can't do, and their ability to defy the laws of human physics doesn't make them invincible. Not to mention the introduction of dip, which can kill the Toons and really raises the stakes, instantly taking this away from the realm of kiddie movie and making it a movie clearly intended for adults that kids will also like. There are several instances where the rules of cartoons either overly complicates things for Roger and Eddie, or where it completely backfires on them. Roger, like most of the Toons, lives to make people laugh, so even though he's heartbroken because there's evidence his wife Jessica is playing patty cake on him. I love all the literal gags, by the way. And he's being framed for the murder of Marvin Acme. He still can't help his nature and will make decisions based on how funny they are. In Eddie's office, Roger finds a pair of handcuffs in a closet and handcuffs himself to Eddie just because it's funny. Because he can defy the laws of physics, he can pull his hands out of the cuffs, but he doesn't for the longest time, even while Judge Doom, who has discovered a way to kill Toons, cleverly with a mixture of the chemicals used to clean animation cells. Roger lets Eddie hide him in soap and water, pretending to do his dishes, while Doom's weasels search his place looking for Roger, and Eddie takes him all the way to Dolores' bar, to the back room, to get a saw. Roger finally takes his hands out of the cuffs when Eddie starts trying to saw them off, and Eddie says, "You mean to tell me you could have taken your hands out of those cuffs at any time?" To which Roger responds, "Not any time, only when it's funny," as if he's bound to a law of comedy. Where it really goes south for him is when Judge Doom walks into the bar looking for him and starts tapping out a shave and a haircut with his staff to smoke Roger out, saying no Toon can resist it. Even with his life at stake, Roger must make people laugh. It's in Roger's nature to take advantage of a comedic moment, so he finally, after trying like crazy to hold it in, breaks through the wall and sings 2 bits. Every time Roger risks his life for a joke, the jokes are actually funny, and again, become a big part of developing his character, Eddie's character, and establishing the world. Though the rules all work more or less the same for all the Toons, they're of course not all wacky and zany like Roger, and that adds a lot of complexity to them as their own race, which is kind of how they're depicted since they're obviously treated differently by humans. You've got the mesmerizing and scintillating Jessica Rabbit, often considered the most provocative female cartoon ever created, and now one of the most famous American sex symbols, who is absolutely fascinating, partly because she's a red herring through most of the movie, set up to look like the murderer, especially after she knocks out Roger, turns out for his own safety, just before Maroon gets killed. While the movie is constantly building familiar cartoon gags and tropes as major story points, Eddie's brother was killed by a Toon who dropped the piano on his head, our expectations along with Eddie's are used against us. The cartoon world is a very literal place. When Eddie orders a drink on the rocks at the Toon Review Club, he gets rocks in his drink, even though he expects that gag and specifically says, "I mean ice." The Toons can't help it. Literal humor is a part of who they are. So Eddie fully expects Jessica, naturally, to be a rabbit. Bugs Bunny is a bunny, Daffy Duck is a duck. But what if a Toon married another Toon, and they were different species? Never mind the obvious, awkward compatibility questions we can't help but ask about a rabbit and a human woman getting together. I like that the movie avoids drawing attention to this, other than having Eddie say to Jessica, with regards to Roger being a bit of a coward, he's a better lover than a fighter, and she says, "You better believe it, Buster." She's called Jessica Rabbit because she married Roger, whose last name is Rabbit. I think that's great. And Jessica, though the most serious of the Toons we meet, still has moments to remind us she's a cartoon, like when she blows Eddie a kiss and cartoon lips fly from her face and hit Eddie in the cheek. She says she's not bad, she's just drawn that way, and that's the truth. She loves her husband and only played patty cake with Maroon to save Roger's job. There's a perfect energy between Eddie and Jessica. He's completely stunned by her and can't hardly function when she's around, and the animated character totally lives up to that. They have my favorite exchange in the movie when Jessica says, "You don't know how hard it is being a woman looking the way I do." And Eddie says, "You don't know how hard it is being a man looking at a woman looking the way you do." There are a lot of throwbacks to film noir dialogue like that too. I think that one's the funniest. Jessica's line, "I'm not bad, I'm just drawn that way," begs the question as to where the Toons came from in the first place. They're apparently made of the same stuff actual cartoons are made of on paper, since they can be killed by the dip, a combination of turpentine, acetone, and benzene, and Jessica comes out and says they're drawn. Given the civil rights undertones in the movie, there's a nightclub only for humans where Toons provide all the entertainment, and Judge Doom has pretty easily managed to lawfully make himself the Toons' judge, jury, and executioner, and they don't seem to have the same rights as humans do. I have to wonder if the Toons are created by humans. And so, as much as I love that line, I wonder if it's going just a little too far. After all, I don't really want to know the background of where the Toons came from and why they're living creatures instead of optical illusions made from moving drawings and animation cells. It's like the Muppets. The conceit is that they exist, and the fact that the humans play it straight is what sells them as real. If the movie had tried to explain it, it would inevitably have been lamer than allowing us to use our imaginations, no matter what they came up with. And it's one of those rare times that film really lets lets us do that. It asks the question, what if cartoons were actually real, and then attempts to answer that, to actually try to create a believable real-world way to make them real, would put it into the realm of science fiction, and that's not what this movie is. The problem with Jessica coming out and saying she's drawn is that I can't help but ask, drawn by whom? Because if the humans actually created the toons, that changes the second-class citizen angle a little bit. Human races are all equal because we're all human beings, no matter the color of our skin or where we come from or anything else, but it's a horse of a different color when you're talking about a race that actually creates another race. But I'm probably digging way too deep into this, so I'll stop now. It may just be a coincidence, but I didn't notice a single black person in the film. It's as if African Americans are replaced with the toons and put somewhat in the same situation they were circa 1947, where they can be entertainers and waiters and dishwashers, but they're not really taken seriously as an important part of society, and they mostly live segregated from everyone else. There's a lot of social commentary here, not only about civil rights, but also about the destruction of great old ideas and institutions in the name of prosperity and progress, with Judge Doom's plan to wipe out Toontown and dismantle the public transportation system in order to create a freeway where he can make a fortune off people paying for the convenience of gas stations and restaurants where they can get, quote, rapidly prepared food, and he doesn't think anyone will even miss Toontown because it'll be replaced with something they'll think is better, something that represents progress. But all this commentary doesn't weigh the story down or come off as too messagey because it's all part of the alternate history. The red car in real life was demolished because of a scheme by car companies to get more people to need cars. And over time, cartoons in the traditional style gave way to television series because of the advent of new technologies that all but swept away the old. In fact, the director and writer's commentary suggests that Roger Rabbit has a lot to do with Disney bringing back major animated movies every year again, starting in 1989 with The Little Mermaid, then Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, The Lion King, etc. This film just offers a new reason for those things, and then, of course, stops them all from happening. The toons not only survive, but they get to keep Toontown because of Acme's will, and the freeway never happens. So is the movie suggesting that these good old days were really a better time and that we'd all be better off if we hadn't had any of those changes? I'd say yes and no. The movie admits that it obviously wasn't a perfect time because of minorities being treated as inferior, represented by the toons. And the big change at the end is that they're given the freedom to own and do with their own land as they please. That doesn't mean all the problems go away, but since they got rid of the guy who most wanted to not only persecute them but commit genocide, it's a step in the right direction. One of the messages the film does make is that nothing is as black and white as we'd like it to be, and that solving real complex social problems takes time. That's why Eddie Valiant doesn't get over his brother's death and stop hating toons overnight. Also, I didn't list making a big point about civil rights as one of the movie's goals because I don't think it really is one. Those issues inform the world at large as they do in the real world, but aren't primarily what the film is about, and I doubt that anyone working on the movie ever dug as deep about what the movie is saying about second-class citizens as I just did. If there is a message that can be gleaned about that at the end, I'm not sure it's an intentional one. So then what primarily is Who Framed Roger Rabbit about? It's about a guy who lost his brother, doesn't know who killed him, and he's looking for someone to blame. Impressively, it makes us care about all that without us actually meeting his brother and without a single flashback. It's a classic detective story, where the case isn't as important as what it says about the guy who's trying to solve it. The title, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, tells us what case Eddie Valiant is going to try to solve, but Roger Rabbit isn't the protagonist. I like that the title is a question about Roger Rabbit, even though it doesn't have a question mark at the end. Roger Rabbit is a hugely important character, to be sure, and he has a lot to do with the changes that he makes in his life, but he doesn't have to be a principal character with an arc because it's not called Roger Rabbit or The Misadventures of Roger Rabbit or something like that. It's actually necessary for Eddie's story that Roger doesn't go through an important change. As relentlessly irritating as he is at first, we do come to see quite a bit of humanity in Roger, how devastated he is about the evidence against his wife, but also because he's a rock. He believes in his wife, and as Eddie puts it, in his rage, he wrote her a love letter. Roger and Eddie are a great pair because they have to learn to find common ground when they have very different worldviews. I should mention that, of course, Roger gets depressed about his wife, but he never accuses her of anything. Roger's philosophy is that everyone is inherently good. They just need a good laugh to let go of whatever makes them so negative and cynical. I suppose this just goes for humans because of Doom, but we'll get to that later. This is best illustrated when Eddie expects the bum at the bar to rat Roger out when Judge Doom offers a reward for him. The customers all know where Roger is because he was just there giving them a show, dancing to Merry-Go-Round Broke Down and busting plates over his head. Roger says the bum won't tell Doom anything because Roger made a connection with him. He made him laugh. Sure enough, he's right, much to Eddie's dismay. This is also the same bum, by the way, who taunted Eddie earlier about working for Toons and got Eddie so angry he forced eggs down his gullet. The movie does a great job of making real people out of even these minor characters and also setting up ideas to be paid off later, like this guy who starts off looking like a big jerk and later gets redeemed when he stands up for a Toon of all people to an even bigger jerk. I should also mention here that Roger's ability to make people laugh is the reason Jessica is with him in the first place, and a neat revelation when she finally tells Eddie this. It's why Roger, wanted for murder while a psychopath is killing Toons and planning to take over his town, can still be happy. Importantly, Roger and Eddie have a similar problem, but because it's Roger's nature to be a carefree Toon, he's able to convince Eddie just by spending time with him that there's a better way to look at things. Eddie and his brother ran a private detective agency together, and they helped a lot of Toons. Eddie started drinking and stopped working with Toons when a Toon killed his brother. This is a simple guy who sees the world as a pretty black and white place. Toons are silly and innocent, and you can trust them because all they want to do is entertain people and act like goofballs. Life back then was easy, as if nothing could go wrong, like in a cartoon. And then he lost his brother and the world got real very fast. When you see things in such a simple way, you naturally adjust your perspective in the same way, and that makes Eddie really cynical. So now, because one Toon did something horrible, he has to hate them all. What makes Eddie a real person is that he's not good at this. He actually has to work at hating Toons. When he goes to the Toon Review and sees his old friend Betty Boop telling her she's still got it even though she's out of fashion because she's in black and white and everything else is in color now, we see that he once had a great affection for Toons, and there's one he still likes. His arc is about realizing the world is a complicated place and that one bad person doesn't make people, or Toons in this case, all inherently bad. He doesn't help Roger at first for Roger, he does it because he was set up. When Maroon had him taking pictures of Jessica and Acme to help make Roger look jealous enough to be the suspect in killing Acme. He does it because, as he says, he was made to look like a patsy. But as he gets to know Roger, as obnoxious as he is, he finds this Toon has feelings, and he starts looking out for him because he doesn't want to see him get dipped. This is a textbook example of character-driven storytelling. His opportunity for change doesn't come at the end, but actually toward the middle. Opportunity for change, by the way, isn't the same as learning a lesson. It doesn't have to be that formulaic. A story is a break in status quo, and that means your character has to go through something unusual for him. Otherwise, it's not a story, but just another regular day in the guy's life. That's why a story requires a character to have a chance to change, even if he doesn't take that chance. Sometimes it's good for that opportunity to come earlier, so we can see if the guy's really committed to it once he takes it, assuming he does take it. In this case, Eddie has decided to be proactive again, to fully immerse himself back in his old private detective role, when he recognizes, without having to say anything, that now he's doing this because he believes in the case and not just for his own reputation. And at this point, he doesn't have much of one. His reputation is for being now a washed-out drunk. After Acme's death, one of the detectives there, taunting him with a cartoon mallet, says, "Didn't you used to be Eddie Valiant?" So now, standing at the tunnel into Toontown, the place he swore he'd never go back to because he hated Toons, pulls out a bottle of whiskey and he hesitates. Whether he drinks it or doesn't will inform every decision he makes for the rest of the film. He pours it out onto the ground, and then pulls out his old Toon Western bullets and braves the entrance to Toontown. But it's not as cookie-cutter as just learning a lesson and then being perfect after that. Eddie's patience is constantly tested after this, and he's inundated with annoying cartoon characters in the bizarre, frantic, maddening Toontown. And then by the weasels in Judge Doom, when it's finally revealed that he too is a Toon, and he appropriately defeats those foes by beating them at their own game, making the weasels laugh themselves to that classic cartoon death where their souls rise up from their bodies and fly away. And he defeats Doom with cartoon Acme products, which, now that I think about it, is apt since he killed Acme. At the very end, Roger checks his progress by asking him if he's still a sourpuss, because he still has a temper. He believably doesn't just change overnight, but he's come around enough that he answers Roger with a joke, by kissing him like Roger kissed him earlier in the movie. I love how their problems are paralleled, and that binds them together as friends, even though they're as different as a private detective and a cartoon rabbit could possibly be. They both even have the same weakness, alcohol, which makes Roger freak out like a train whistle and keeps Eddie from moving on with his life. The last thing I want to talk about is Judge Doom, who is the extreme personification, though a hypocritical one, of the way Eddie has come to see the world after his brother's death. Doom not only hates Toons, but he wants to kill them all. I think his insane takeover of Toontown and the way he manipulates his way into being a judge and being able to lawfully kill Toons, like the Toon shoe he kills just for a demonstration for really no good reason, has something to do with Eddie's re-evaluation of the way he looks at Toons, along with his relationship with Roger. Doom's motivations are clear. He wants power, and he wants to be the only Toon left, living as a human and molding their world to his own design, but how he got this way is unclear. We know he hates laughter, as he's constantly telling his weasel henchmen they're going to die laughing if they don't stop, and so perhaps he hates the idea of Toons, even though he is one, and Roger Rabbit's whole Toon philosophy about making the world better by making people laugh. So is he disgruntled because the human world didn't take him seriously as a Toon, and maybe he blames his whole species for that? Is that why he's murdered humans and is now trying to manipulate the world for his own desires? The question is it a problem we don't know more about him? I've complained in my superhero movie reviews about some villains not having enough of a motivation, that I don't really see them as real people. But the reason that happens usually is lazy writing, the idea that a villain can just be out for revenge and he can be totally two-dimensional and cookie-cutter because all that matters is that the good guy has a force to combat. But Judge Doom isn't a lazy villain at all. He's fascinating. A Toon pretending to be a human judge who hates laughter and wants to kill his own kind to build a freeway. The villain plot in this is quite ingenious, and although Doom is the obvious choice for being behind all the murders and the framing of Roger Rabbit, the movie does a fairly good job of planting other possible subjects too, like Jessica along the way, to make us think Doom is just there to throw us off base. In the commentary, Zemeckis says there were a number of possible culprits thrown around before Doom was finally decided upon, including Jessica and Baby Hermit. And although we're not really surprised when he turns out to be behind it all, I know I was completely taken aback to discover Doom was actually a Toon the whole time, and that was an enormously satisfying reveal. Christopher Lloyd is terrifying in this role, providing us with clues along the way that he's really a Toon by never blinking on camera, because those aren't Doom's real eyes, of course, and knowing so much about Toons because he really is one. He's not just a generic villain, and yet I still would have liked to know a little more about him, at least one of the Toons maybe recognizing him and telling us whether he was, like Jessica, drawn that way, or if he used to be a Toon who used to love making people laugh and then he lost his mind. The idea of a cartoon who can break the laws of physics and who can't get killed except by, ironically enough, a compound he himself created, going totally postal to the point where he's now immune to cartoon laws, is a scary thought. I'd like to know if that's what happened. I do think he's a great original villain, and I like how evil he was allowed to be in a Disney movie. The writers wanted to take it even further, though, making Doom the Toon who killed Bambi's mother in an early draft, but that was where Disney drew the line. Who Framed Roger Rabbit is one of the most innovative, original, and creative movies I've ever seen. It had a real impact on me as a kid, and it hasn't lost its magic for me. This film was made before CGI was the norm, and while well-integrated CGI allows us to put things on screen now we never could have before, there's nothing quite like seeing all these practical effects and cell animation together. The sheer ingenuity and resourcefulness is mind-boggling. Put in a compelling story and a beautiful reverence for the medium it's an homage to, and you've got a masterpiece. I'm giving Who Framed Roger Rabbit a 4 out of 4.